Hi, I'm Joel McLeod.
And I'm Roland Tanner.
Welcome to the 905er. As we mentioned on our Tuesday episode this week, we are focusing on our veterans and the important part that they have played in preserving and protecting our freedoms here at home. Without them, we wouldn't be able to even think about producing this podcast that you're listening to right now. All of us as Canadians, regardless of your political affiliation or belief, owes them all a profound debt of gratitude. One institution here in the 905, the Juno Beach Centre, is working hard to preserve, protect, and promote the legacy and history of the Canadian soldiers who participated in the Battle of Normandy during the Second World War. Today, we speak with Alex Fitzgerald-Black of the Centre about their mission and the challenges that they are facing in keeping this important part of Canada alive during the age of COVID-19. Please have a listen. Okay, I'd like to thank Alex Black for coming on the 905er today. Alex is with the Juno Beach Centre, headquartered here in Burlington, Ontario. And I'm just going to throw it over to you, Alex, to maybe just introduce yourself and share with our listeners what the Juno Beach Centre is all about.
Perfect. So, yes, thanks for having me, guys. Joel, as Joel said, I'm Alex Black, or Fitzgerald Black. I have the hyphenated last name anyway. And I'm the Operations and Outreach Manager at the Juno Beach Centre Association. Now, the Juno Beach Centre Association is the charity that owns and operates the Juno Beach Centre Museum and Education Centre in Normandy, France. And that museum has been open since 2003. And it was the brainchild, the vision of a number of veterans, especially one whose name is Garth Webb, and he passed away in 2012. But before he did that, let's put it this way. By the early to mid-90s, the Second World War and the memory of the Second World War in Canada was not in a very positive place. And he went overseas to Normandy for the 50th anniversary of D-Day. He had landed on Juno Beach with the 14th Field Artillery Regiment as a lieutenant. And he got there and realized there really wasn't much to mark the Canadian contribution on Juno Beach on D-Day and in the Battle of Normandy. There were a few memorials to individual regiments, like the Queen's Own Rifles out of Toronto, the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, the Regina Rifles, out west, those are some examples, but there was nothing there that told the entirety of the Canadian story on D-Day in the Battle of Normandy and for the Second World War. And so he had this vision to create a museum and cultural or educational center that would kind of fill this void. And so he started fundraising along with his partner, Lise Cooper, who was the widow of one of his fellow veterans, and a number of other veterans who came on board and their children. And they worked to fundraise over, almost a decade to establish the Juno Beach Centre. They raised over $10 million, and the centre was opened on June 6th, 2003, which gave them 1 year to ramp up for the 60th anniversary.
I think, it's one of those things you mentioned about the work of veterans, and I think in our collective Canadian imagination, we remember monuments like Vimy Ridge. We remember the war cemeteries overseas to commemorate the Canadian lives lost in the First and Second World Wars. But for such a long time, the Battle of Normandy, the Canadian perspective on that was lost for such a long time, and the fact that Canadians stormed the beach at Juno, and we took the objectives, and we played a huge part in the defeat of Nazism and fascism, and just something that there's something we said about being modest and typically Canadian, but it's one of these situations that no, this isn't one of those times. This is not the time to hide our light under a rock, so to speak. So we heard that this institution was being done, and it was headquartered here in Burlington. It was something that we just thought, no, people need to hear more about this.
Absolutely. Vimy Ridge is an interesting conundrum for Canadian history. It's so mythologized. There's kernels of truth to that myth, but they make for such a compelling story. And I think that's part of the reason why Canadians kind of tend to gravitate towards Vimy Ridge. Vimy Ridge is special from the sense that the entirety pretty much of the Canadian active army that was fighting overseas, they all fought on the same day, all four divisions advanced together. The First World War was a much more, let's call it a concentrated war for Canada, in that the Western Front is kind of the most important thing for Canada, and that's where most of our effort went, at least in terms of on the front lines. With the Second World War, it's much more complicated than that. It's a global war. It's a war that sees Canadians, serving not just in huge numbers in the Army, but also in the Air Force and the Navy. And the Navy and the Air Force are even though the Army didn't really get going in terms of major combat until Hong Kong in 41 and Dieppe in 42, and then later in 43 in Sicily and Italy, the Air Force and the Navy were, fighting. There were Canadians in each of those services fighting the war from its very first days. And the reality of the Second World War as well, because it's such a global conflict, because there's so many battles to talk about, and they're not concentrated necessarily on one front, it's less easy to tell that kind of concentrated national story where everybody contributed to this one victory. Even at Juno Beach, and we had an incredible contribution at Juno Beach. There were 14,000 or more Canadians who landed on Juno Beach. There were about 500, about 500 Canadians with the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion who parachuted into Normandy, late, on the night of the 5th and 6th. At the end of the battle, by the end of the Battle of Normandy, about 90,000 Canadians had served in the Battle of Normandy. 5,500 were killed. Some 18,700 were wounded. The Battle of Normandy was very, very bloody. I mean, if I put those numbers up against the entirety of the Italian campaign, which lasted from mid-43 to February 1945, the numbers are pretty close. And we're talking in Normandy just a 3-month period. But with the Second World War, again, because our effort is so dispersed, it makes it more difficult to tell that one, there's not that one really crucial battle that everybody can point to. I think Juno Beach is probably the closest we can come to that. And it's the other thing that's important about remembering a battle. And this is what Tim Cook says in his latest book, a fabulous book called The Fight for History. And I encourage both of you to pick it up and read it this Remembrance Day, and any of your listeners. Is, Vimy Ridge is a very prominent piece of ground. It's a ridge, and they built a beautiful monument on top of it. Juno, the equivalents in the Second World War are not as obvious. Dieppe for a long time kind of captured Canadians' memories, and that's a very visual thing. You can kind of picture Dieppe, this like seaside village, the town, I should say. It's not really a village, it's much bigger than that. It's technically a city, I think. But, you can picture that between the cliffs, and it's very easy to imagine that battle, and it's just for one day. Juno Beach is close to that as well, but it's connected to the wider Battle of Normandy that goes on for 76 more days. And so, again, it's kind of harder to concentrate. We tend to concentrate our memory around Juno Beach and around D-Day. That's when the big commemoration happens. But we're really honoring, the entirety of the Battle of Normandy and the sacrifice Canadians made, which was quite high.
And of course, moving on from that, the invasion of Europe, in effect, and the continued battle right through until the eventual victory in Berlin. So what you've done is astonishing, and I'm just looking at your website here and the beautiful building that was made. So the initiative behind the entire Juno Beach Centre seems to have been Garth Webb, who you mentioned at the start was a veteran himself. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about him and what he achieved in essence through putting the centre together.
Absolutely. So maybe I'll start kind of from the beginning. So Garth was born in Calgary. Correct that. Garth was born in Midland, Ontario, and then grew up in Calgary, Alberta. He joined the Canadian Army I believe it was in 1942. Yes, he joined the Royal Canadian Artillery, so branch of the Canadian Army, in 1942, and he became an officer. So he was a lieutenant in C Troop of the 14th Field Regiment. And on D-Day, the 14th Field Regiment was one of 3 field regiments that was part of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, and that was the division that went ashore on D-Day. And they actually had self-propelled guns. So these were American-built M7 Priests, which were guns. Usually a field regiment has a gun that's towed by a tractor or a truck. And these guns, they're actually built on the chassis of a tank, and the gun is there instead of like a turret. And so they came ashore on D-Day and had a pretty bloody time of it. Early on, they got hit. Some of members of his battery were killed in an ambush when an 88 gun opened up on them as they were setting up in an open field just kind of inland from the beach. And so there's an interesting story to that, and I guess I can come back to it. But basically, there was nothing there to honor, his regiment and that sacrifice on the day either. But he still set out to with this vision for the wider Canadian sacrifice and the wider war, to commemorate it and mark it. And it wasn't just Garth alone, it was his vision that kind of got things started. But in the mid 90s and kind of leading into the early 2000s, this was a time when Canadian Second World War veterans were obviously now in their retirement years. They had a bit more time on their hands. They'd come back home and they'd help build the modern Canada. Building businesses, continuing to serve in the military in some cases, but just generally, setting the path forward for the Canada that we inhabit today. And basically, in the mid 90s, Canada did start to wake up to the Second World War because the veterans were now in retirement age, because the veterans did start opening up more about their war experiences, but also because of the major anniversaries, the 50th anniversary in 1994 of D-Day, and then the 50th anniversary the year later of the liberation of the Netherlands. And when the Canadian veterans went back for that anniversary in particular, they were welcomed, with open arms by the Dutch. And it really made Canadians wake up when they saw, CTV News, carrying these stories about how much gratitude there was over in France and in the Netherlands for what the veterans did. And, that's one of the things I think we forget on Remembrance Day sometimes, is we do talk a lot about, we remember the soldiers who fought for our freedom, but it's freedom overseas as well, right? That's something that's very important to the Juno Beach Center, and that's why, a big part of this commemorative effort in Normandy at the Juno Beach Center, it's kind of a fusion of Canadians remembering what their grandfathers or fathers did, and the descendants, and still in some cases the actual people who were liberated over there. And so Garth really got together and brought together these groups of people to help raise the money to build the center. And it was at a time when veterans were really trying to fight for their history and to get their history recognized. And so the Juno Beach Center is one kind of shining example of where the veterans kind of stood up and said, there is no National War Memorial. There still is no National War Memorial in Canada for the Second World War. The dates for the Second World War, 1939 to 1945, I believe were only added to the National War Memorial, the response in Ottawa, in 1982. So it took, almost 30 years. And there were proposals to create a national memorial in Canada, and those have never come to fruition. So this was a moment, some 20 years ago now, where the veterans were banding together and trying to figure out, we need to fight for our history. Here's how we can do it. And they put their mark on Juno Beach with the Juno Beach Center.
The center in France is, I've never been. I probably won't go this year due to the pandemic. But it from what I've seen online, it really is a very beautiful looking building. But I wanted to kind of touch upon something you just mentioned about how when our veterans went over to Holland and to France, to Normandy, and they were welcomed with open arms. Today we all live with like the stereotype of, oh, everybody loves a Canadian, right? We're such a likable, lovable people. And I think sometimes it gets lost that this is kind of where that stereotype began. This wasn't just people just like, oh, Canadians are so lovable. It was because, our we had 18, 16, 18-year-old boys, and they were boys, marching through, the dikes of Holland to liberate the Dutch from Nazism, and that's it. It's a connection that we have with the French, the British, the Dutch, and the Europeans, and it's something that I think we take it a bit for granted on this side of the pond, if you will, that we don't really owe up that much to our contribution and our literally our blood ties to the people of Europe.
It's an important point, actually. I'll just chip in if you don't mind quickly. I mean, obviously you can tell from my accent, I'm an immigrant here. I grew up in Britain, and now very proudly a Canadian. But it's an important difference that Canadians have almost always, when they've been called on to serve, been serving in the interests in some ways of others, because Canada wasn't in any immediate threat from Germany or from Japan. But when called upon, Canadians went, uncomplainingly and with enthusiasm to serve overseas against fascism, and that's a big deal. It's definitely something to be very proud of. And in this kind of age where, certainly current politics and history can seem very selfish at times, to think of those people who were just willing to up sticks and go to a foreign country thousands and thousands of miles away and risk their lives, and often give up their lives in pursuit of democracy and freedom is really an astonishing thing. And it's obviously so important that we teach each new generation of that fact and the distinct aspect of it that is Canadian in that.
It's a really interesting couple of thoughts that you've put into my mind here, Roland. One is just the fact that there were about 500,000 Canadians who served. So there were 1.1 million Canadians who served during the Second World War in total in the Army, Air Force, Navy. I believe the Merchant Marine is included in that as well. Of that number, about half of them, about 500,000, served in the UK at one point or another, whether they were, using that as a transit to get to somewhere else in the world because it still was the center of the British Empire, or whether they were there defending it, in the air, at sea, potentially on land. It never really came to that, of course, but that's what the Canadian Army would have been doing in 1941 had a German invasion happened. The other thing is, the Second World War is a major point of transition for our country in Canada as well, because during that conflict, the motivations of Canadian soldiers and sailors and airmen kind of vary, right? You've got a bunch of people who, as you've kind of suggested, they don't really have a connection to the mother country, and they're just doing it because it's the right thing to do, or maybe it's we were coming out of the Depression, so maybe it was there was a financial aspect to it. Who knows? There's so many different reasons. A lot of veterans you talk to will say, well, everybody else was doing it. My entire high school class was joining up, so all the guys were gone, so I had to do it too. But there's also, those who did have connections to the mother country. And in fact, because the Canadians spent so long, especially the Canadian Army, in Britain during, between kind of 1939 and 1944, there's some incredible connections that were had there. One is, a lot of these people had relatives who lived in the UK, and so they got to go, on their leave, they got to go visit them. So many of them ended up marrying British women, and it's an interesting statistic I always point to. So approximately 45,000 Canadians were killed during the Second World War, but we actually gained almost as many war brides. We actually almost as many. It was like something like 41 or 42,000, and that doesn't even include the children, because of course there were about 20,000 children as well that came out of that. And now, not all the those are the war brides who actually came to Canada. and not all of them stayed. Some of them had difficult times adjusting, and or maybe their husbands weren't quite truthful about what they were getting into, going to some farm in rural Alberta, who knows. But regardless, it's just an interesting point of connection with Britain. And then shortly after the war, and even during the war, we are moving away from the British sphere of influence and into the American sphere of influence. The very reality that North American defense becomes incredibly important during the war, and Canada has to come to agreements with Roosevelt and his administration about, if Britain does fall, what happens, how, probably the British Navy sails to Canada and continues the fight, but what happens, right? And so they had to start taking action to figure out, and those connections really started to build. They were already building before the war, but the war was kind of a catalyst to shift our focus to America as well. So it's a fascinating topic.
What's the reaction to the French, those who live in Normandy, and maybe the European continent as a whole to the center? How, I know we have a sense of Canadian pride over kind of a job well done and that sense, but I'm wondering, what has been the reception from the European people to this Canadian museum?
I think it's incredibly positive. One thing I'll note is that our staff at the museum is kind of half French and half Canadian. So our executive director out there is actually the descendant of people who were liberated by Canadian soldiers. So that connection is very strong. Obviously, we send the Canadian guides over there every year, and they're kind of a really big, important part of the Canadian face of the center, to put a Canadian face on it, to have a Canadian greeting when you show up. And that's part of our mantra. We're a museum and education center, but in some ways we're kind of an informal embassy for Canada in Europe. A lot of people come there to learn about Canada in Europe. We have we're kind of separate or special, I would say, from some of the other major museums on Juno Beach, on the D-Day landing beaches, because they focus on D-Day, the Battle of Normandy, and a certain component of that, whether it be a national component or whatever. Our museum is about the entirety of Canada's war effort, and it's also about Canada's place in the world. And so there's a lot of French school groups that come to our museum, French families that come to our museum to learn more about Canada. On the same note, Juno Beach in Normandy is a beautiful tourist destination, and it's much closer to places like Belgium and the Netherlands than Canada is. More accessible. You can do kind of a weekend vacation, to Normandy. And actually, that's something we've seen, earlier in the pandemic. Even though we had to close for some time and then we were open again. Over the summer, we had a lot of groups coming in from Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, because it was their kind of opportunity. They could still travel within Europe, and it's a place for them to come. And we actually have Dutch language accessibility at the museum for that very reason. And so it's not uncommon that we get groups from all over Europe to come and learn about Canada.
Now, you mentioned there COVID, of course, which casts its shadow over absolutely everything at the moment. How is that affecting you? And part of your remit is obviously fundraising, I presume, to maintain the museum. How are you struggling because of COVID to make your usual kind of targets?
Yes, absolutely, we are. So that last year in 2019. Because it was the major anniversary, the museum did 100,000 visitors, which was a record for us. We were really excited about that, and the potential for the 75th anniversary of the end of the war to do not equally well this year, but 90,000 visitors was our estimate. Unfortunately, COVID-19 forced the museum. There was a lockdown in France back in the early spring, and so the museum was closed between mid-March and June 5th. Thankfully, we were open for June 6th, which was just an absolute blessing, because we never expected that to happen, but we got the go-ahead. The museum was open over the summer, but of course, with COVID-19, safety and health measures in place, but that limits the number of people, A, who are coming to the museum just generally, and B, the number of people who can be in the museum at any one time. So we were open over the summer, did okay. But now now France is in lockdown once again for at least the month of November, which is really a shame because Remembrance Day is not maybe a big attendance day. It's November's not like we're off season now, so November's not a huge month, but Remembrance Day is still usually a decent attendance day, and usually we have a ceremony. Now, there's not going to be a major ceremony this year. There's going to be, our executive director out there is going to lay a wreath, and we're going to film that and put it on social media. But that's about all we can do because they're locked down. They can't invite anybody to come and observe. And it's really unfortunate because one of the things we had planned is, and this leads into kind of how we're responding to this, is we're kind of pivoting the way we do fundraising. We have a number of established programs that still work even with the pandemic. We have commemorative bricks that are the bricks that essentially built the Juno Beach Center, where people can honor, a veteran or someone close to them who served. We also have a new flag sponsorship program whereby people can go online and get a flag that flew at the Juno Beach Center, and we'll ship it to you as a thank you for your donation. So we have those two programs; they're still operating. But in terms of major other fundraising, we had to pivot. And so one of the things we did is we teamed up with VR Pro, which is a race business that does really great races, running and that sort of thing in the Burlington area and beyond. And they've switched to virtual races as well. And so we're doing the Remembrance Day races, which are a series of virtual races raising money for the Juno Beach Center. And those have been quite successful. We've raised pretty much, I think we're just about to pass $60,000 raised there. And so that's been, really kind of, we're really grateful for the support we've received from Canadians at this difficult time. We have a veteran named Jim Parks who landed not a stone's throw from where the Juno Beach Center is today on June 6th. And he's actually walking one of the race distances, the Strong Point 1500 meter, in support of the Juno Beach Center. And he's already raised $10,000. His initial goal was $1 for every Canadian who was killed in Normandy. So $5,500. He's now at $10,000, and he's hoping to get to closer to $18,000, which is the number of Canadians who were killed, wounded, or missing in Normandy. So we've done a lot of things to try to mitigate the effects of COVID-19, but the reality is if this thing continues, into next year, we're going to be in, the museum's going to be in substantial trouble.
If any of our listeners of means are hearing you right now, what can they do to help keep this important Canadian institution going?
Well, I just kind of named off a couple of our initiatives there. I would definitely encourage everybody to go to junobeach.org/donate and check out our various programs. You'll find the flag sponsorship program there. If you go to our website, junobeach.org, you'll also find links to the information about Jim Parks and what he's doing as well. And so you can donate directly in support of his campaign as well. So those are kind of two of the main ways that people can help us at the moment.
Fantastic.
And just the other thing, if I can add, is if once the pandemic is over, plan to come and visit the Juno Beach Center. And hopefully this thing will be over in 2022. 2022 is a big commemorative year for Canada. Once again, it's the 105th anniversary of the Battle of Vimy Ridge. And by the way, Vimy Ridge is only like 3 or 4 hours away by car from the Juno Beach Center, so it's really easy to do both of those. And if you want to take a bit of a detour, almost in the middle of those two sites is Dieppe, and in 2022 we'll be commemorating the 80th anniversary of the Dieppe raid as well. And so 2022 is a really good year if you're, assuming the pandemic has passed us by, to come and travel and visit some of those sites. And the Juno Beach Center would love for you to join us.
Well, we really hope that's possible again soon, and I certainly would love to do that. I know it's been an ambition of myself and my wife as well for some time to be able to visit some of the sites in Europe, and certainly that would be very high up the list. And in the meantime, certainly encourage anybody listening who'd like to donate to as you say, go to your website at junobeach.org. Which is very easy to remember, and there's all sorts of resources there for anybody wanting to know more about the story of Juno Beach and Canadians in the war generally. So it really is a fantastic resource.
Well, thank you for saying that.
We're at a point where a lot of our veterans are passing away, but the lesson of the Second World War and the importance of trying to avoid something like that happening again is important to impart, I think, on the next generation and generations to come. And I'm wondering, maybe you can touch upon maybe a bit more about the educational aspect, just to how do you see your role as empowering the Canadian legacy and imparting the lessons, the hard fought, bloodstained lessons that our veterans learned onto our children and our children's children, so that we can make better decisions for the future.
Absolutely, it's a great question. Like you said, we're losing our veterans at a very rapid rate. 1.1 million Canadians served in 2019 March. I think Veterans Affairs did a survey, and it looks like back then there were only about 33,000 Second World War veterans left. So fewer back then, and of course we've lost a number since then. Than the number of Canadians who were actually killed during the war, which is quite incredible. Where I think it'll still be maybe another decade before we lose every single one, but it's happening rapidly. And yes, that's the mission of the museum. It's to continue on their legacy. It's to educate people, Canadians, people around the world, about Canada's role in the war. And the Second World War is a bit of an oddity in a sense. I mean, it was a necessary war, and I think it's really important to ask the question, what is worth all that suffering? Because even if it was a necessary war, there was such incredible suffering in the world. Canada was very fortunate in terms of the war effort, how it kind of evolved, and that we didn't have very many casualties until very late in the war. But other countries, were not, so lucky. Russia's a good example. Great Britain's another example. Poland is another great example. So absolutely, that's the message the veterans leave with us. We have a series of veteran interviews called The Legacy of Honor, and that's, once again, one of the educational resources on our website. So I'd encourage anybody to go check those out. And most of the veterans, end with a message, for peace. Like they say, this was a great adventure. I'm glad I went through it, that sort of thing. But, I hope this never happens again, because the sacrifice that was necessary was all too high, as low as it was compared to other nations, right? So absolutely, that's a key component of what we teach at the center. And it's really important, we are not here to glorify war in any way. We're here to just tell the stories and to make sure that people remember.
And it was a world war. It was a global effort in which Canada came together with so many other people to fight against fascism and to give up so much in the process to do the right thing in appalling circumstances. And like you say, that's a lesson we all have to know, because goodness knows it seems like the whatever there is in the human condition that can give rise to fascism and hate, it's still there. And unless we are constantly vigilant, it will come back. It's more important now than ever. Certainly, I know I'm just saying what's perfectly obvious, but more important now than ever that we remember this, why we did it, and keep it at the forefront of our minds.
Absolutely. And I think I would add one other thing to that as well. We're going through a major global crisis right now. It's not the same as the Second World War by any stretch, but people are dying. So there's a couple things I think we can take from our veterans and learn from them. One is the resilience they showed in the face of uncertainty, in the face of, a losing war effort in the first couple of years. 1940, 1941, things aren't looking very good, right? So there's resiliency, and those are the types of stories that we've been trying to turn to increasingly during COVID-19 to show, our veterans were able to step up then. They felt they had a civic duty to do that, and let's do that now. And if that means, you have to wear a mask when you go outside, very, very minimal thing for you to do. You're not signing up to go to fight a war against the Nazis. The other side of it is, let's give some thought in this crisis, just as the veterans did themselves at the time, to how can the world be a better place as we emerge out the other side. We're going to get through this, but how can the world be a better place? How can Canada be a better place? And that's one of the things, and there's a lot of really good research on this. And actually, a lot of it's been done by a British scholar named Jonathan Fennell, and he wrote a book, came out last year, called Fighting the People's War. And in it, he looks at the combat motivation of the Commonwealth armies, British, Canadian, New Zealand, Australian, South African, Indian, what have you. And one of the things he found in his study is that people, the soldiers during the war, they tended to vote in like kind of 1945. A lot of the British and Canadian soldiers and some of the other dominions as well, they tended to vote fairly left-leaning. They tended to vote for, Labour candidates in the case of Britain, or in Canada, Liberal candidates, or the CCF, as the NDP kind of used to be called back then, the descendant of the NDP. And it turned out the closer you were to combat, the more likely you were to vote for a kind of a left-leaning party. That's not to say everybody voted that way, but basically they were interested in social change, a lot of them. They were interested, okay, we went and did this, we put our lives on the line to fight this war. What's society going to look like after? Are we going to be left behind like a lot of the veterans were in some cases in the First World War, or is it going to be better than that? And out of that, at least in Canada, which I know much more about, Britain was broke. They carried a lot of the war effort in the early years, and they were broke. But Canada actually did very well out of the war because we had this growing industry, and we had the U.S. as our major trading partner right next door. There was an opportunity there, and Canada invested in its veterans, right? They gave them educational grants. There were grants for them to buy houses and things like that. And we really invested in that generation after the war. And that's part of how we built the better Canada. So my larger question is, okay, as we emerge, there's the funding, obviously, to, give us a leg up during the pandemic. But as we go forward, what are we going to do, whether it's at a government level, whether it's at a grassroots level, whether it's at a business level? What are we going to do to make sure we have an even better country and world going forward? And that's something the veterans, they fought for a better world, and that's what we always have to do.
I think you touched upon the importance of knowing your history so that we know where we've been, so we can kind of have an idea of where we're going in the future. And you know what, I'm gonna think we're gonna leave the episode on that note, because I think that's kind of where that sums up everything we want to kind of focus on going forward. So Alex, I want to thank you and all your colleagues at the Juno Beach Center, both here in Canada and overseas in Normandy, for the great work that you're doing to continue Canada's legacy and Canada's history going forward. We're going to post your donation details on our show notes and on our website so people can contribute going forward. And thank you very much for taking the time to come on this week. That's it for this episode of the 905er. Thank you for listening. As always, you can send us your feedback, thoughts, and concerns or ideas for future episodes to our email, info@905er.ca. We'd love to hear from you. You can help us keep the 905er going by financially supporting us through Patreon as well as PayPal. Visit us at 905er.ca and click on the support tab. As well, links are in the show notes for your convenience. Lastly, you can find us on social media. Search for _905er on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So long for now. See you next time.
You looking to make the most out of this life and optimize your personal wellness? Then check out the Natural Man Podcast. Join me, host Mike C., as we explore all areas of human wellness, physical, mental, and emotional. Learn strategies to optimize your own well-being and be in the driver's seat of your own health. Remember, your doctor works for you. Learn biohacks, neurohacks, ways to improve sleep, and ways to optimize your body and your mind. Check us out on Apple, Spotify, the Fountain app, and at naturalmanpodcast.com.